This is the story of how a handful of small volcanic islands in the Indonesian archipelago reshaped the course of global history. A story of greed, power, and blood. A story that may not be in your history textbooks, but should be. Welcome to the Banda Islands in the early 17th century, where a massacre and the control of nutmeg sparked a turning point in the world's trade routes, empires, and economies that we still feel today. First, let's set the stage. Imagine a world where spices are worth more than gold, a world where the taste of nutmeg or cloves on your plate is a status symbol, a token of wealth. European nations, desperate to control the spice trade, had turned their eyes toward the East Indies, to the Banda Islands in particular. These islands were the only place in the world where nutmeg trees grew naturally. They were a literal gold mine of spices, making them irresistible to empires hungry for wealth and power. The Portuguese were among the first Europeans to reach the Banda Islands in the early 16th century, but their grip weakened as the Dutch and English entered the region. By the early 1600s, Dutch East India Company, or VOC, had grown into one of the most powerful corporate entities of its time, essentially becoming a military and trading powerhouse. The Dutch viewed control of the Banda Islands as essential to monopolizing the nutmeg trade. To them, nothing could be left to chance. Let's pause here to talk briefly about the Bandanese people. The inhabitants of the Banda Islands were experienced traders in their own right. For centuries, they had engaged in sophisticated networks of trade with Java, Sulawesi, and other parts of Southeast Asia. They were neither naive nor submissive. The Bandanese wanted to maintain independence and play European powers off each other for the best trade deals. Their leaders, eloquent, savvy negotiators, believed they could coexist with these foreign powers. They would live to regret this assumption. The tensions between the Dutch and the native Bandanese had escalated through the late 16th century. The breaking point came in 1621 when John Pieter Zoon Cohen was appointed Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies. Cohen was not a man for compromise. He believed that monopolizing trade necessitated eliminating competition by any means necessary. For Cohen, the equation was simple: Dutch success versus Bandanese existence. On a morning in March of 1621, Dutch soldiers armed with muskets, cannons, and ships invaded the Banda Islands. Cohen's forces vastly outmatched the Bandanese, who resisted valiantly, but were technologically inferior. What followed was more than just a military conquest. It was an act of calculated brutality aiming to extinguish an entire population. Historians estimate that of the original 15,000 Bandanese inhabitants, only about 1,000 survived. Thousands were killed, others fled, and the survivors were enslaved and transported to other regions to work in the Dutch colonial economy. The Banda Islands, once thriving with independent traders and their vibrant culture, were nearly emptied of their people. The Dutch then repopulated the islands with slaves and indentured laborers, establishing plantations, or perken. These plantations were run by Dutch-appointed managers, called perkeniers, to ensure nutmeg production directly fed the VOC's monopoly. But Cohen's actions did more than just crush the Bandanese. The massacre and subsequent colonization secured Dutch control over the spice trade for decades to come. With control of nutmeg supply routes, the VOC grew into the richest corporation the world had ever seen, rivaling the wealth of sovereign nations. Dutch ports, as far away as Amsterdam, became gatekeepers of luxury goods, transforming the Netherlands into a global economic powerhouse. The short-term consequences were devastating for the Bandanese, but monumental for European geopolitics. The monopoly over nutmeg gave the Dutch leverage over rival powers, especially England. In fact, the Dutch traded Manhattan Island to the English in 1667 for full control of another spice-rich island, Run, part of the Banda Islands archipelago. Yes, that's right. New York City became an English possession because spices were, at that time, considered far more valuable than undeveloped land in the Americas. The long-term impact of the Banda Islands massacre cannot be overstated. As the Dutch expanded their colonial reach, they set a precedent for corporate-driven imperialism. The VOC's model, with its privatized armies and brutal exploitation, would later influence other corporate colonial powers like the British East India Company. Moreover, the Massacre disrupted regional trade networks in Southeast Asia, which had relied on the Banda Islands for generations. Neighboring kingdoms from Java to Sulawesi felt the ripple effects as the Dutch expanded their territorial ambitions. The Bandanese culture, once rich with unique forms of art, trade, and governance, was all but erased. Yet, like so many tragedies in history, the Banda Islands massacre is often overlooked outside academic circles. Fast forward to today. The globalized world of trade and commerce owes much of its structure to legacies like the VOC. The Banda Islands remain a small, relatively obscure part of Indonesia, their fields still growing nutmeg, but under vastly different conditions. The story of these islands, however, echoes in global history as a cautionary tale about the costs of greed, empire, and monopoly. The Banda Islands massacre reminds us that turning points in history are rarely clean. They're often bloody, complicated, and steeped in injustice. And yet, they shape the world we live in. Every nutmeg-laden dessert, every modern trade route, every corporate monopoly owes something to what happened on this small cluster of islands over 400 years ago. So, the next time you see a jar of nutmeg sitting innocuously on a spice rack, remember the extraordinary story behind it. Historian Simon Schama famously said, "History is not just what happened, but a continuous conversation about what it means." Today, we continue that conversation, acknowledging not just the grandeur and wealth, but the suffering and resilience that define our shared human legacy. Let's remember the Banda Islands not just for their riches, but for the lessons they still teach us. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from the corners of history that you didn't even know you were missing. Until next time, keep asking questions and digging deeper into the past that makes us who we are today.